So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my talk on trust, relevance, and capacity. So what I wanted to do is just start by, well, as a general opener, I guess some of the issues that I'll touch on are particularly germane to LGBT people of colour and also people of colour generally. And I think it's quite important to flag up as they both intersect, but also are intensified by people's plural identity as also people LGBT. Can I get the next slide, please? So trust, relevance, and capacity. These just in a sort of simple watchword, I think, are the key issues that confront the Kiki Bristol. And from Kiki Bristol, sorry, let me just explain. So Kiki Bristol is the group that I'm representing, a group of QT-POC, queer people of colour, that came together in 2016 to sort of answer the absence of organisation and space that was available in Bristol for the QT-POC community. But in many ways, when we're asked to do this seminar, I thought these are at the heart of the challenges that we face and at the heart of the problem around increasing number of QT-POC volunteers and BME volunteers generally. Next slide, please. One of the issues I think often comes up when we're looking at diversification is what are we aiming for? What is the sort of groundswell? What is the foundations, in any case, of volunteering or other sort of social phenomena? So what we can see is that 22% of people in the population volunteer, and that ethnic minority volunteering within the Black communities looks at 25%. So in many ways, then, it's more than the case, I think, as we'll come on to discuss, as to where people volunteer and why they don't volunteer for organizations which they might identify as being white. Where are they present in other spaces? Next slide, please. So again, this gives us a sense of volunteering by gay, lesbian, bisexual population. And we can see once more that there is the mixed and multiple ethnic groups is quite widely represented. So again, I think there's a question around where people are present or not. Can we next slide, please? So to understand why people are why volunteering may be a challenge for QT-POC people, it's important to consider the general social experience. So this is, in a sense, how do we experience the world? And of course, it's not for me to speak for all QT-POC people, but I think it gives us a sense of why some communities and why some cohorts in a society feel more that it's easier to access spaces and why not. I think it's just about taking a whole person, a broader social experience approach. So I go then to my next point, the experience of intersectional discrimination, both on the basis of sexuality, sexual identity, and also of race. And that this cuts across, this is both specific and cuts across different spaces in which QT-POC people occupy. Next slide, please. So some of us will be familiar with Stonewall's recent research, which found that 51% of LGBT respondents experienced discrimination from within the community. And certainly it was the case that as a member of Kiki, and also through research that I conducted in Bristol previously, that there were multiple experiences of discrimination that many QT-POC people had experienced. I think it's important to say some of this came out of, I think, a general racism. So I think we'd like to think that if we have suffered discrimination, then that actually we would be more alive to discrimination against others. And unfortunately, I think that's quite idealistic. And so that white LGBT people can be as inclined towards discrimination, implicitly or explicit bias microaggressions as the non-LGBT community. But I think there's also something else within that too, and certainly within the club environment and so on. And that is, I think, the legacy of, or even the sort of pervasive discussion of homophobia within QT-POC communities, or rather, sorry, within BME communities. And that often means then that QT-POC people are assumed to be sort of are tarred with the same brush and not seen as specific and individual, or even members of the LGBT community. So certainly I've experienced being sort of turned away or double questioned on the door. And it's a sort of defensive reaction, which on the one hand one can understand with the sort of prominence of certain kinds of murder music. But on the other hand, it in some ways is erasing that presence of the QT-POC community and the contribution it's made, and actually its own struggles against those tropes within the music culture, not just the white music culture, sorry, the BME music culture, but also within a white one. So discrimination took the form of feeling excluded from LGBT spaces, racist language and behavior. There's also a different kind of exclusion, and that's in some ways when the codes of the club or social environments really are designed not to cater for or to presume that your presence. Sometimes there's an intersection between faith and race, and so in that intersection, again, one is presumed. How can you, for example, be a Christian and LGBT? And so faith can be seen again as, and this can sometimes come up in casual use of language, but an idea then that it's antagonistic to LGBTQ identities, which presents problems for QT-POC people who may still adhere to their faith and be navigating their own theological and religious journeys. Next slide, please. So, as in heteronormative and online and physical spaces, BME people experience online abuse and or exoticism. And just to take this quote, so what I'm trying to do is create a picture of the world in which QT-POC people often find themselves. And we know that within the online dating culture, people don't pull any punches when it comes to the exoticizing or the discrimination against QT-POC men and women. So gay men make no fuss about ordering their men a la carte, from weight to hairlessness to masculinity. And in the safe cover that dating acts occupy, no spice, no rice, no curry, no chocolate. And that's from a Korean American who wrote this article reflecting on his own experiences. Next slide, please. So to just give a breakdown of this sort of typology, no rice is Far East Asians, no curry, South Asians, no chocolate, African descent. And this is sort of similar to the troping that existed, perhaps still exists, within the it sounds almost 19th century. And certainly it kind of has echoes of certainly the sort of immediate post-war, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. But while we occupy a certain polite society, it's these sort of informal networks, the online world in which a reality of how people relate and are discussed and talked about is revealed. So it becomes very difficult then, or these are factors which are lurking in the background when it comes to how we want to be in spaces. Do we want to be in spaces in which actually this informal language and othering may still be present, but just hidden? Next slide, please. So by contrast to the previous slide, no rice, no chocolate, and so on, there is, of course, the objectification of black bodies. And again, this has its parallels in the heteronormative so-called world. So this is a quote by Jeffrey Ayovatana. Forgive me if I've stumbled over the pronunciation. And this is in a conversation with a friend. Black men are for fucking, white men are for bringing home to your family. So this kind of, again, this sort of form of online objectification is what many people experience in their private circles. And again, takes the way in which one, or the degree to which one may wish to interact and relate outside of one's private life. Next slide, please. And this too, this sort of so-called language of, ironically given as a form of a celebration, but in fact has its own problematic associations. Just as to use borrow the term, to use or revive that term, sorry, N-word, the N-lover, then a white man who prefers black men is called a dinge queen, rice queen, again for a person of Asian descent. And this is something, this sort of exoticizing is something which intersectional artist Travis Albanza has spoken about in their work. Dating and not being regarded as enough of a black man, not fulfilling the sort of trope. You're not the masculine I ordered, because again, not fulfilling that stereotype. So what we're finding is then that people's private experiences, even if this is of course not suggesting this is entirely the case, but within communities that leads to a suspicion that is this lurking in the background. It sort of heightens the reservations and reserve that people feel. Next slide, please. So there's an ironic situation that often occurs too, so moving on, and that's black flight from white spaces. And that actually one's degree of confidence and therefore willingness to be in a space often depends on whether you enter the room and see that there are others like you. If you're entering a white middle class space, or let's take race out, the color out for a moment. If we're entering into a white space and you're working class, then often there is a great deal of mental work that goes into navigating that space, adopting the norms, using those efficiently, surviving that space, feeling confident and recognized in that space. Add color into the mix, add race into the mix, and you see the intensity and the labor that's involved to be able to feel comfortable and empowered in that space. Even when there is a degree of cultural continuity, or contiguity, I should say, based on shared experiences, university, tasting music, or so on, then still race can be a barrier where it's presumed to mean much more than it sometimes does, and that contiguity is invisible, partly because we're often sort of reading social experiences which may or may not exist because, well, we've read about what black people and cutie pop people experience, from The Guardian. And sometimes it just makes it very difficult to just feel that you can just connect in that space. So constantly code switching is vital for survival, is nonetheless draining. So certainly what I've seen in various groups, not just QT-POC, and especially, in fact, just more broadly, that where there are classes and groups where BME people are few in number, it's actually almost a circular problem, because then people are less inclined to join those spaces where they feel isolated, invisible, and where they feel they have to do a lot of labor in order to be visible and to feel connected. And of course, some people navigate those spaces, but it's often a problem that way too.
Edson, just to let you know that you're halfway through.
Okay, I'll speed up. Thank you. Next slide, please. So, and this, just to reaffirm that point, this is one of the things which a Kiki member flagged up recently when I said I was representing the group as regards this topic. Sometimes I find volunteering spaces incredibly white middle class. I know this is inherently wrong, but it can make me feel uncomfortable. Some people are not turning up because it may feel like a space not for them. So next slide, please. So one of the issues I guess I would suggest is trust and the inheritance of invisibility. So where, in a sense, there's been an absence of recognition of QT-POC presence, then it means that that's created a pattern, an expectation. It's created a legacy where organizations are now doing catch-up. How do you now convince a community where you've been, where perhaps more could have been done to express their presence and welcome? How do you now convince them that you're sincere and that they are on board? And so what tends to happen is that it can become, within QT-POC circles, a lasting suspicion that's very difficult to overcome and defeat. The next slide, please. So relevance, what are the challenges facing BAME communities? Are they the same as their white peers? So I suppose what I'm drawing attention to is that we know that BAME communities volunteer, we know that that QT-POC people volunteer, but in the desire for, let's say, white-led organizations to call on Black volunteers, are the issues that they wish to address versed in the same idiom, expressed in the same way, expressed in the same idiom? Are they even the same problems that QT-POC communities face and challenges? So to what extent are these additional challenges shaping the choices of the BME LGBT people? And these challenges, say, of race, of the criminal justice system, of the multiple ways in which a race and class exacerbate the other kinds of statuses which we occupy. How are these things exacerbated by plural identities? And is this then what is where many of the QT-POC community are looking to put their energies into? Next slide, please. So let's say, for example, then, that we know that unemployment rates for Black Caribbean and Black African young men stand at 29%, almost to double the average unemployment rate. That's in 2016. And the unemployment rate for women age 16 plus was 4.7. So employment, health, housing. When we're looking at these statistics, we're also thinking, are these the kind of issues that are also being addressed by LGBT organizations that are white-led? And is this, and if not, then how do you hope to attract the interest of BME communities? Next slide, please. So again, exclusion, and I won't talk too much about that, but just highlighting that education exclusion, and so these are intersectional issues, basically, that the QT-POC community, part of multiple BAME communities, are also at the forefront of challenging school exclusions, housing, employment, and so on. And this informs, again, the volunteering alongside their work as QT-POC members of the community. Next slide, please. So, and again, homelessness and invisible homelessness. But what is, and this again is a particular issue, I think, for the QT-POC communities, and why statistics are difficult to, well, there are missing statistics, I should say. So, for example, I was unable to find information around who is out, or the percentage of people who are out in the workplace among friends, or among friends among QT-POC communities, and among peers. And I think that's important because, again, this may be one of the sort of focuses of the QT-POC organizations and people generally, is around the dangers of coming out and potentially becoming homeless, the treatment by their communities as a result. And we know that LGBT people are more likely to experience, young people are more likely to experience homelessness. And this again may be exacerbated for the QT-POC communities. Can we, next slide, please. And we can see that differential statutory homelessness house rules, there's a greater number among the BME background, but we don't get a sense of how that of the relationship between that and the QTPOC community. So whether or not the QTPOC community, and I suspect it is so, also experience differential rates, increased rates of homelessness as a result. And again, also the targeted violence, sexual exploitation, and substance abuse, physical and exposure to physical use, physical and mental health problems. So it's a double bind then to qualify for LGBTQ support could also mean losing QTPOC social circles. So this is one of the focuses and one of the challenges for QTPOC organizations is how do you support members of the community who are not out, who are at risk of becoming homeless, at risk of physical violence. And to what extent are these visible concerns, the kind of exacerbators present in the work being done by LGBT organizations that we can sort of describe as white-led. And I know that's problematic because, of course, organizations are diverse in many ways, but it's how they may appear on the outside. Next slide, please. The other key issue is capacity. So QTPOC people, BME communities, as members of the BME communities, also have been hit hard by the decimation of the third sector, which I think really began with the marketization of the sector under Labour, and of course accelerated by the Tories, and followed by austerity. And certainly in Bristol, what we've seen is the collapse of many voluntary organisations that provided support within communities. So LGBT Bristol survives, and even in terms of course, thinking of sort of white identified organisations, it's a struggle to survive. And I know that one of the key organisations in Bristol, which I've worked with, is now surviving through consortium working and has less scope for development research and embedding and connecting new avenues of work. So we're all struggling, and the BME sector is struggling in particular. And in Bristol, some of our leading organisations have closed. And that means then that these issues of capacity and connection are even more fragile. There's fewer resources available. There is even more potential for burnout and overreach and stretch by people within their communities, both statutory and voluntary. And so therefore, it's difficult to volunteer, and people volunteer given the lack of capacity in what they see as unique and culturally relevant spaces. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, few organizations, few resources, and it just reiterates the point I said earlier about the concentration on firefighting in issues that may seem to face the community, in particular whether QTPOC or BAME generally. And that means then that so we know that connectivity means that, and joint working can mean that we can face common struggles together, support each other together. But often that needs time to reflect and see the offer of joint working. And it's difficult sometimes when you're firefighting to stay alive. Next slide, please. So in some ways I've flagged up many problems, but here's some thoughts. And we can build up and crucially sustain relationships. So the key thing is, how do you build connections with existing QTPOC organizations, BAME-led organizations, to increase volunteering? This goes to the heart of trust and capacity. And if we are all living in a world in which we have limited capacity, but that there are community partners which have the trust of their community members, QTPOC or BAME, generally, and intersecting. If work with those partners, because in some ways they are the hand holders, they are the ones to which trust is deferred, which will allow people and give people the sense that actually volunteering generally is something that they wish to do. Kiki Bristol, which I've mentioned, that I'm one of the founders of, we're volunteer-led. The ask is brilliant. We've seen that Bristol in particular and the LGBT organisations and collectives have really risen up and said, invited Kiki into so many initiatives. But actually, we don't have the resource to always take up those organisations. Kiki's at a particular stage in development where, in some ways, many of our volunteers don't want to sort of rush into being seen as opportunities being paid. But certainly, I think down the line and with other organisations, it's really important to kind of think of what is the asymmetrical resource relationship. That if you have more resource, financial or otherwise, how can you support a community partner so that they can work with you more effectively, so that they can attend meetings, so that they can market opportunities, so that they can work with you on marketing opportunities, on placing information, on language shifts, on what will work to increase volunteers. But they need the resource to do that because, again, this may not be their priority focus and why they came into existence, even if they do recognize and want to support. Understand and actively support the priorities of BAME and QTPOC organizations. So bear in mind that there is an intersection of needs, but there are also specific things which the QTPOC and BAME communities face. And in some ways, the great allies are also really passionate about, and I hesitate on the word allies, I say great friends are as passionate about what their friends are suffering from, their causes and their interest. So rather than thinking, how can we increase volunteering, but also think, how can we support campaigns? How can we be visible, whether it's side by side or as a supportive, but almost backseat passenger role? How can we make ourselves visible in that way, so that then the message is clear that our interest is equal, and also also encourage people to think, well, actually, history has shifted. We are visible in these new in these LGBT spaces where there hasn't always been the case, or seemed to be the case in the past. Last slide. Offer a variety of volunteering roles for those who cannot be out. So the demographics of a city really shift the impact and the visibility that people may wish to have. So in a city of a relatively small BAME demographic, you're also talking about very close and intimate connections between communities, perhaps different for students and so on, a transient within a city. Well, for QTPOC people who've been resident in the city, may be in networks in which they are not known to be members of the QTPOC community. Actually volunteering, especially in high-profile events, is effectively outing them. And again, depending on what sort of social situations they occupy and the personal and private situations, that exposure could lead to ostracism, could possibly even lead to violence. So think about what kinds of volunteering roles and how you can also be mindful that of these issues, so that people understand. Yes, people understand. So patience, there is a gap, a trust gap, a relevance gap, and we're all playing catch up, both to learn to trust and also to learn to correct and to move forward positively. Now, the other question, consider what is the likely point, I should say, what is the likely number of LGBT participants, but other participants you'd like to reach? I think sometimes when we think about diversity, I think one of the missing points, I think, is that we can become very exercised about a lack of diversity. But what is the demographic reflection? What does that mean for the population? So in a city like Bristol, a smaller BAME demographic, a smaller QTPOC demographic, what would be a good marker for representation to know that we're making some inroads what would that look like? And of course, it'd be great to aim higher than that, but I think it's important to kind of be able to base your campaign, your reach, on the available demographics. Otherwise, it's all a little bit woolly and can actually feel that and untargeted, and I think can create more anxiety around diversity than actually some clarity about what the likely response is, and then being able to target that.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. We've come to the end of your half an hour. Thank you. Do you just want to run through the next couple of slides very quickly?
This is just some references, and if there's an opportunity, I'll supply some more in the coming weeks. So yes, just some references to chase up, which I referred to here. But again, the key thing I would say is there's a lot of research that's missing that I think is quite important if we are to understand the challenges around volunteering. And I think it's the intersection, things, for example, like where are QT-POC people volunteering? Where are the BME community volunteering? We know that people volunteer in church contexts, in informal networks, and so on, which means then that may be their main focus. But also, if they are volunteering in those contexts, we know that volunteers are often up for volunteering in other contexts. These are the partner groups that you want to be aware of, especially as sometimes if they're informal networks and there's there's resources that can be shared as a way of encouraging them, then you know these are groups to partner with. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And Lucy, if you could just run through the next couple of slides, please. So these are organisations that Dr. Edson's involved in, and then the next slide is also how you can get in touch with him. Is there anything you'd like to add, Dr. Burton?
No, I think I'll leave it there and I'll pick up in the Q&A.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. It was a really thought-provoking presentation. We're now going to move on to our second presentation for today, and that's Barclay Wild on the topic of intersecting identities, building inclusion. Over to you, Barclay. Thank you.
Yes, thanks ever so much, Annie. And if we could have the next slide, please, Lucy, that would be really, really great. So I really welcome your thoughts, Edson, on particularly how the spaces often seem separated. That's certainly something I'm taking from the talk that you just gave. And also, we as an organization are increasingly hearing stories from our clients where one of their larger challenges is how to bring communities together, bring communities into their resources, into their services, so that that better reflects identities and better reflects intersectionality. And as an organisation, that's certainly something that we're consciously aware of and how we can overcome that challenge. Next slide, please. So we're a community interest company. We were established in 2012 and we work across the UK providing training, consultancy and research. And one of the core values for us as an organisation is that we are equalities led. And what that means for us is that we all come from a background, both personally and professionally, of being involved in the equalities field. Certainly, for many of us, that's for many decades, and also that we come with lived experience. So, for example, our cultural awareness and our cultural competency is delivered by trainers who come from a background that's of a BAME background, for example. We're also, as an organisation, acutely aware that we need to be researching and evidencing everything that we're doing, everything that we're saying, everything that we're putting into the world. And that, I think, has been made a focus of in your talk, Edson, about how with reducing resources, there is a need for us to evidence base, and we are attempting to do that through partnering with further education, higher education, with researchers and academics, and certainly partnership work is something that's important for us in the way we deliver and shape services. We're far more interested in collaboration than we are in competition, even though we are in a competitive environment. So we would certainly I think as an organisation, we would never put ourselves in a competitive place in terms of competing against a Black-led organisation, for example. That's something that we would be really mindful of. Next slide, please, Lucy. I want to start the talk then by this quote, sharing this quote, which is something that was said to us by a young person at an event we ran. And that young person said two main key points for me, and they underline, I think, everything we do. And I think there's some resonance with the talk you gave, Edson, which is that about, if I'm not seeing myself reflected or represented, then I don't think you are for me. The young person also made a point around, we have a piece of legislation, we have the equality law we have in this country, and we have those protected characteristics. And if we see ourselves reflected in services, in groups, in organisations, then we are more likely to trust that organisation. We're more likely to want to go and access support because we see ourselves. And I gave this talk to a client at their annual general meeting, and I said, I'm going to pick up a resource, a publication, a booklet like your annual report, and what am I going to see on the front cover? I'm going to see white British, a mum and dad, 2 kids and a dog. That's the representation I see. And I sat down after my talk. My colleague who was sitting next to me put the hot off the press annual report of the client organisation in front of me, and it was literally that image on the front cover. I hadn't seen it. I was just talking in a general term. And so I went to challenge the commissioner, the client, at the break time, and they said, oh, well, if you look on page 30 or page 32, you might, you'll see our equalities page. And they were really proud of that. But I think for us, it needs to be at the forefront of everything we're doing. We need to see representation. We need to see ourselves reflected. Next slide, please, Lucy. And in a sense, we don't have a level playing field. There are barriers and there are obstacles, and we can make some adjustments. We can shift from equality to equity. We can remove those barriers. We can take those physical barriers away, those virtual barriers away, whatever it is we can do to actually ensure that as organizations, as services and groups, we are becoming more inclusive. And that's across the board. It's not just about one particular intersection. It's absolutely across the board. So there are things that we can all do as organizations to make those reasonable adjustments, to take away those barriers. And when fear of discrimination or fear of othering or fear of just being isolated or in a situation where you perhaps are literally having to fight your corner, it really does challenge individuals when they're accessing and coming to groups and wanting to work for organizations or engage with services or seek support or seek help. Next slide, please, Lucy. So this is a model that we've adapted from a publication called Describing the Emperor's New Clothes. It's a way in which we work with dominance and oppression and how we try to explain intersectionality. And this model is particularly based on the notion of power and privilege. And so in a sense, as any model, it's not saying it's the default, it's not saying it's right, it's just helping us to try and understand what are often quite complex notions, complex kind of theories. And basically the model is saying if we're above the line, if we're above that horizontal power line, we're doing well, we're doing okay. And if we're below the power line, then we're doing less well. So for myself, I'm a white man, I have white privilege, I have male privilege, but I'm also a gay man, I identify as queer. And so in a sense, some aspects of my identity will give me more privilege, more domination, and I'll have more access to resources. And in other senses, other parts of my identity will mean that I have less access to power and privilege and other resources. Next slide, please. And equality is not like pie, is it? That when you're accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. Yes, that's the sense, but actually we can all have equality and we won't run out of it. It's not like we're cutting up a slice of pie and we're going to give each other a piece and then it will run out. We can all have access to that equality, and we can all build on those issues around capacity. Next slide, please. The impact, though, of all of those issues on individuals, particularly around minority stress, can impact upon many aspects of identity, many aspects of behaviour, things like mental health, self-harm and suicidal ideation, thoughts and feelings, etc. But the core of that is that it can actually impact upon who we are as individual people, as the whole of our identity, and that can lead to loneliness and isolation and mistrust and all those different areas in terms of minority stress. And there's work that needs to be done as a result of all of that. Next slide, please, Lucy. And any organisation, any group, any service can enable this change to happen. Culture change takes a long time, and I don't have patience. I want culture change to happen. And so leadership has to be involved in this. It has to be at every level of any group or every level of any organisation. It can be things like policy change and monitoring and training and recruitment, etc. We can also take positive action, things that can actually lead to, instead of the burnout that happens often from minority communities, from equalities groups, being the only people that are standing up, or the individual within an organisation standing up and saying this is the things that need to change. We can all do that across all organisations, and leadership has to be an important part of that. Next slide, please. I just want to finish with that quote from Joe Cox, that we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than things that divide us. And last slide, please. That's just a way of getting in touch with us. Thank you, Annie.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Barclay. Really interesting presentation. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A session, and I'm sure that there are going to be quite a few questions coming our way. So just a few notes. So Lucy's now going to switch off the recording, and she will start writing fast and furiously